This is Daniel Simon from Baton Rouge Community College. This is week 4 of my lecture series for History 1123. This week, of course, we'll be talking about World War I, also called the First World War. This is part 1 of this series, which will run from around 1914 to about 1915, the early part of the war. Now, World War I will eventually break out due to what is called the Balkans Peninsula area. That area, of course, at the time was an area which was often seen as the powder keg of Europe. Look at this map I've got here. You should have in your lecture. The area in Europe, which of course was the Balkans Peninsula, was that area that's kind of in that circle right there, which includes like Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, kind of like between what is Austria-Hungary and where the Ottoman Empire used to be. And that area was kind of a powder keg because of the fact that there were a lot of pro-nationalist Slavic peoples that wanted to break away from Austria-Hungary or the Ottomans in the East. And so it created a lot of animosities that would eventually lead to World War I breaking out. Like I told you before, the rise of nationalism had a lot to do with it. And a lot of these Slavs that lived in that area wanted a kind of a greater Serbia, or what they later call a Yugoslavia, which will be formed after the war. Will be there throughout most of the Cold War as a state. So it's this idea of a Slavic nationalist state that they wanted, that caused it. There was one group that was, of course, in there, which was in Serbia, based in Belgrade, which is the capital of the Kingdom of Serbia at the time. It was called the Black Hand. The Black Hand was this type of pro-Slavic nationalist group. That was kind of a secret organization that was part of the Serbian army in the Kingdom of Serbia. And it had this guy that was one of the leaders of it. His name was, of course, his Slavic name was Dragutin Dmitrievich. And Dmitrievich went by a nickname, which is Apis, A-P-I-S, you see there. They also call him Colonel Apis. I think Apis was a nickname which meant the bull. So I guess because his mustache there kind of makes him look like a bull or something like that. So that's what it meant. He was supposedly the mastermind behind the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which took place in Bosnia. And eventually got 7 Bosnian youths to sneak into Bosnia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, to try and kill the Archduke. And of course, you got a guy back there. You see this picture here. His name is Gavrilo Princip. Yeah, Princip. Some say Princip, but 19-year-old Bosnian youth. He was one of the guys that, of course, involved in it, and of course, the one that would eventually kill the Archduke in Sarajevo, Bosnia. And anyway, so he went with the other Bosnian youths. He was part of an organization called the Young Bosnia, and they were kind of a pro-Slavic group that wanted to break away from Austria-Hungary. And they were armed with guns. They had grenades. You know, they also actually brought cyanide with them, because I think it was supposed to be this secret mission where they were going to kill themselves. It's kind of like some kind of James Bond thing, if you think about it. So they were snuck into Bosnia, which is next to Serbia. And anyway, at the time, the Archduke, which we've talked about before already, he was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That's his wife, Sophie Chodik, I think is her full name. And he was there the reason why he was in Bosnia at the time, he was going there to, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was doing some troop exercises near the Serbian border. So he was there to watch what was going on with that. And he brought his wife with him too. And they thought they would, tour the city of Sarajevo And of course, as you know, they toured in an open convertible car, which is what you're seeing there on the right there. That's the car that they rode around in the town. And that date was June 28th, 1914. That's the actual car, 1910 Graf stiff double Fenton convertible. The assassination of the Archduke is kind of like what happened with John F. Kennedy, 1963. It's kind of a similar kind of thing. The open convertible, what could go wrong, that kind of thing. And so anyway, the day of the assassination, the Archduke visited with the mayor of the city of Sarajevo. They toured this city. Anyway, what happened was there were 2 attempts on his life. So 2 of the 7 men that were sent into Bosnia actually did try to kill him. The first incident was a deal where there was a youth. I don't know if you would even know the guy's name. If I have that in my notes or not. I think his name was Kabranovich, I think his name was. But there was one guy that actually threw a bomb at him. And the bomb actually hit the car, but it blew up and injured a few people, but it missed the Archduke, and he wasn't killed in the initial assassination that they had. So at that point, he met with the mayor. He was pretty furious about this attempt on his life. He probably should have gotten out of town at that point. He told the mayor, he said, "One comes here for a visit and is received with bombs." He was really mad about it, furious about it. So I guess them throwing flowers at him, he thought. And so the Archduke didn't think about leaving at that point. He thought that wouldn't be the right thing to do. And so what he decided to do is get back in the car. You're, of course, right here, the car. And he decided to, let's go ride to the hospital. We'll visit those that were injured in the attempt on my life. So that's what they do. So that's the picture of them getting back in the car, I think, and riding toward the hospital. And apparently on the way to the hospital, they took a wrong turn. They were trying to back up. And what happened was Gavrilo Princip actually had thought pretty much that they wouldn't have a chance to kill the Archduke. He was actually getting a bite to eat in a cafe, and he walked out. And there the Archduke and his car's backing up toward him. Just kind of luck, I guess. And so he walks up to the car, and without really aiming, he just fires 2 shots. Pow, pow. And, of course, what happened was he accidentally shot Sophie first. Shot her in the stomach. And then the Archduke was shot in the neck, and both died pretty much on the way to the hospital. Kind of ironic. So both get killed, basically. Princip, they arrested him right afterwards, and the soldiers practically beat him with their swords. They took their swords out, the broadside of their sword. They started beating him in the head with their swords. He actually tried to commit suicide. I think he tried to shoot himself, Princip, with a gun jam, and then he tried to take the cyanide. That evidently must have been old or something, and it just made him sick and threw up. And so he couldn't kill himself. So he gets captured. Princip was only 19. He would end up actually imprisoned afterwards. But at his trial, he claimed that the reason why they shot the Archduke had nothing to do with the Archduke himself. They thought he was an okay guy. They thought that killing the Archduke would lead to that greater Serbia or Yugoslavia type state that they wanted. So they thought that would happen. So they kind of did in a certain indirect way. But by Princip killing, the Archduke and his wife, that, of course, would help spark the war. And it would end up leading to 10 million people getting killed, soldiers-wise, in the war. And he would actually die in prison during the war. I think of tuberculosis or something like that. So, but he didn't get the death penalty because I think the death penalty for Austria-Hungary was like 20 and he was 19. So, Colonel Apis was later arrested, I think. What happened to him? I think the Serbians later hung him because they didn't know that all this happened. They were kind of secretly doing it behind the Serbian states, back, whatever. He was actually hanged for it during the war in Serbia themselves. So, So that's what happened to him. But anyway, there was this big state funeral with the Archduke and his wife, and at that point, Austria-Hungary was furious about the war, about what happened to Archduke and the wife getting killed, the Austro-Hungarians. The ruler at the time, which was Emperor Franz Joseph, his administration, and of course, like all the generals under him, wanted war with Serbia at that point. And so what happened was by July 23rd, the Austro-Hungarians gave an ultimatum to Serbia to turn over some of the people that were behind the assassination, or they would get invaded. But they decided they were going to get invaded anyway. And the ruler of Germany, which was Kaiser Wilhelm II or William II, he basically decided to back Austria-Hungary because they were in the same alliance. They were the triple alliance that we had talked about before. And so he practically told the Austro-Hungarians that, hey, we're going to give you a blank check. If you want to go ahead and attack Serbia, go ahead. And so pretty much Austria-Hungary saw that as a green light to go to war. But what's going to happen, of course, with this is that the Russians are going to start to get kind of worried about it too. Because, Serbia is a state which has a lot of people that are Slavic and Orthodox Christian. And so the Russians decide, we're going to back the Serbians in this whole mess. So that happens with that. And it creates this diplomatic thing that's called the July Crisis, which happens at the end of July of 1914. And so both those alliances, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, start to kind of mobilize their troops because they realize they might have to fight a war. And so that's eventually going to blow up in just a few days. There was a frantic deal between, I think it's like July the 29th to August 1st, but between Russia and Germany, the leaders of those countries started sending telegrams to each other. I don't know if you ever heard the story about this. It's called the Willie-Nicky telegrams. And Kaiser Wilhelm and Emperor Nicholas II, those are the rulers of Germany and Russia, they were cousins. And so they started sending telegrams to each other, basically saying, hey, don't attack, because this thing might blow up into a big war. And so the Kaiser called, Nicholas Nicky, and Wilhelm called Nicholas the other name, say Willie Nicky, that kind of thing. And so that's hence the names of what they called it. But it was like too late, really, for them to really do anything about it. This is over like 4 days. And pretty much the generals of their armies had already decided that they were going to go to war. So it didn't matter what the hell they sent, message or whatever. They were going to go to war anyway. Now, the only thing is, though, the Germans realized, which we'll get to in a second, they're going to have to fight this thing out first. But before that happens, Austria-Hungary goes ahead because of that blank check with the Germans. They decide to go ahead and fight a war. And so what ends up happening, Austria-Hungary, you see right here, decides to invade Serbia. What you see is, right here, basically. They invade Serbia, that circle right there. That occurs on July the 28th, 1914. Was the exact month after the Archduke was killed. July 28th, 1914. Now, a lot of people view that as the beginning of World War I. And, of course, it doesn't pan out like they think. That's what's funny about when Austria-Hungary invades Serbia. They actually get beat pretty good by the Serbians. Serbians actually put up a fight. It doesn't go well. And Austria-Hungary doesn't fare well in the war, if you know about it later. But that's the first incident that really sparks the war overall. And then other countries start to jump in after that occurs. Now, one of the things that happens with the World War I at the beginning of it is that Germany realizes that they're going to have to fight a two-front war, because Germany's going to have to fight the Triple Entente. It's got Russia and France, and then you got the British. Both are in two different directions. And so the Germans had been working on this military plan since 1905, which was called the Schlieffen Plan. It was developed by this German general named Alfred von Schlieffen. He went back to the 1860s and all that in Germany. And the Schlieffen Plan was this military plan to stop, like the idea of a two-front war, or to prevent it, basically. And the idea was this. I've kind of got a map of it right here showing you what happened. There's a map in the, I think maybe in the slides, maybe showing it. But basically, the idea was to attack the French first, because the French had the better military than Russia did. Of course, they would attack just like the Franco-Prussian War. They were going to invade through Belgium and Luxembourg. And then you see, sweep around Paris and take Paris. And then the idea of it was then to take their forces and then attack east towards Russia, secondly, using, like, I guess, trains or whatever, like railroads. And that would be easier to defeat the Triple Entente, because Russia had the weaker military, and they were probably further away as well. So you'll see later it doesn't really pan out, because the Germans didn't put enough forces on the Western Front side. And then I think Russia invaded the east through, like, Poland, East Prussia, and so they had to put more forces over there to stop that. And so it ends up falling short. It's one of the things that will happen later. But that's why the Germans decide to declare war on France and Russia, which expanded the war in 1914. And so the Germans declared war on Russia on August 1st, 1914. And they declared war on France on August the 3rd. And then August 4th, the Germans invaded Belgium and Luxembourg with their armed forces. And at that point, when the Germans go into Belgium, the British kind of decide at that point, like, which side they're going to back. And with a few days later, they think on August the 5th, I think is the date, 5th or 6th, usually the date, the British decide to declare war on the Germans too. So at that point, you've got basically Britain, France, and Russia fighting the Germans at the beginning of the war. And Germany's, backed by Austria-Hungary. Italy was supposed to also get in there too in the war with the German side, but they decided to stay neutral at the beginning of the war. And in 1915, they'll later come in on the Allied side instead, because the Italians wanted a piece of Austria-Hungary, part of, like, their southern territory, like near the Alps, I think it was. So that's pretty much why they would get in the war later, but they're neutral at first. So basically, World War I, in a sense, was a chain reaction war. It was having all these different alliances fighting each other, and that's how the war blew up at that point. All right, now the German offensive then, like I say, in August of 1914, pushed into Belgium. Belgium would pretty much fall pretty quickly within, I think it fell within, like, maybe 18 days. Belgium didn't last long. And they would pretty much occupy Belgium throughout the war. And then the Germans pushed into northern France. The reason why the Germans wanted to go into northern France, because that's where most of France's industries are. And, of course, they could take Paris. And at that point, the British came in to back the French. They brought in what is called the British Expeditionary Force. They supported the French armies in France. And the two eventually would combine forces by September of 1914. That led to one of the first big battles of the war, which was called the First Battle of the Marne. It's happened around the Marne River east of Paris. This was a battle which involved 2 million troops on both sides combined. It was massive force. And the biggest battle, really, since, you could go all the way back to the Battle of Leipzig, or Battle of the Nations, which happened in 1813. So 101 years ago, the biggest battle they had before. So about 600,000 troops. And in both sides, almost had 1 million each. I think the French-British side had a little more than the Germans did. I think it was like 1.1 million. I think the Germans had like 900-something thousand. And the French had the French Sixth Army. It was their main army that fought at the Marne battle, along with the BEF. And what happened was the French basically brought up all their forces, including the reserves. So if the Germans would have broken through, that would have been the end of the war. There was no more forces, pretty much. And it got so desperate for the French side that the French, actually, this is kind of a funny story, but the French used taxi cabs or any kind of cars or trucks to bring up reinforcements to fight in the battle. That's how desperate they were. That kind of played a role in why they were able to slow the advance down. And the first battle of the Marne lasted about 5-6 days, September 5th to about the 10th, east of Paris. And they stopped the Germans cold. Their offensive at that point drove them back. And at that point, what happened was the Germans then started digging in. They realized that the offensive had failed. They weren't going to take Paris. And so the Germans started digging trenches in like a defensive war. There's this thing called the race to the sea. You may have heard about this on both sides, the Allied and the German side. And both sides began digging trenches from like where the English Channel is all the way to Switzerland. They build up these defense lines up and down what they call the Western Front, which becomes the main front. They fight in mostly northern France and Belgium. And so the war stalemates, which it will in northern France. And the Western Front was the bloodiest front that was really in World War I. So it's a very, very bloody front. And most soldiers that do get killed in the war pretty much get killed in that one. Now, in fact, I've got like a number on it. The amount of casualties combined on the Western Front was 13 million troops. Yeah, that were killed and wounded in the war. And we'll get to it later, a lot of the deaths were associated with, you know much about it, sickness, like influenza and other sicknesses. So more men were killed from really sickness than disease, than actual battle deaths as a whole. All right, now, there are other fronts in World War I, I guess, which I'll mention about as well. Of course, the Western Front's the one that's most famous, I told you, which was fought in northern France, in part of Belgium. And that was like the Germans versus Britain, France, United States, and other allies would fight, in that area. They also had the Eastern Front, which I'll get more into later, not this podcast. But the Eastern Front was in mostly Western Russia, Ukraine, Poland area. And that pitted Germany, Austria-Hungary, and their allies and the Central Powers versus what is mostly the Russians. That didn't go well for the Russians. They lost that campaign. In fact, I'll get to it later, but the Central Powers do drive the Germans back into Poland and then the Ukraine. And they think, in a sense, that the Eastern Front was one of the fronts that helped to cause, the Russian Revolution later, which broke out in 1917, which would end the Romanov, pretty much, dynasty. They also had the Italian Front. The Italian Front was mostly fought in the northern part of Italy. And Italy decided to get in the war in 1915, so they declared war on Austria-Hungary. The reason why was that Italy wanted to seize part of land that was up in the Alps. It's like kind of northeastern Italy, kind of right above Venice. So they got into a bloody war, and that part of the war was really tough because there was a lot of mountain fighting in mountainous regions, and they had to fight in the winter in the Alps. And I don't think either side really did well in that war. But I think Italy would come out on top and seize some land out of that. Also, I think they seized some land on the Adriatic Sea. They took from Austria-Hungary as well. Italian Front's kind of famous, like in America here, because Ernest Hemingway, if you remember correctly, actually participated in the Italian Front. He was like an ambulance driver during the war. And I think out of that, he wrote a book later, one of his first novels he published later, which was called A Farewell to Arms, so which kind of influenced that. So, yeah, there was like a Middle Eastern front that occurred where the British and their Arab allies fought the Ottoman Empire, because I guess the British saw as an attempt to weaken the Turkish Empire in the east. They fought mostly like around Palestine, Jordan, Syria. They also tried to invade Turkey through the Gallipoli Peninsula, which failed, which was part of that Middle Eastern front. I'll get to that later about that. Not that you may have heard of that campaign. Have you ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, which is a classic movie? I think made in the early 60s, I thought it was. I forget when it was made, probably early 60s. And yeah, Lawrence of Arabia, or T. Lawrence, was a famous British officer that helped aid the Arabs fight the Turks in the war. And the Arabs later called him Lawrence of Arabia because he would dress up in Arab garb and all that. So, and they would actually, the British would eventually seize, I think, Palestine. I think they seized control of part of Jordan and all that during the war. And it would later lead to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after the war. Yeah, there was a Balkans front, which I mentioned earlier. The Balkans, I told you the powder keg was where the war started. It was like Austria-Hungary versus Serbia, and that war didn't go well. Austria-Hungary got beat by the Serbians, which is crazy. They didn't do well in that one. African front, yeah, there was a front in Africa where the Germans fought the French and the British predominantly in East-West Africa. Actually, the Germans fared well in the African front. And the Germans had this general named Latau Verbeck. I think his name was von Verbeck or something like that. I believe his name was. He was a pretty good general. And he fought with German and African soldiers. They actually beat the British and the French. Yeah, actually did well against them. It's actually one of their best campaigns they had outside of Europe. But they lost the war and they pretty much lost their colonies later anyway. And yeah, there was Atlantic Front. Of course, the Germans used their U-boats, their submarines, if you know about this, to try and blockade Britain and France. And they sank a lot of Atlantic shipping. It's one of the major causes later of why the United States entered the war, because they started sinking a lot of ships, which had Americans on them, and they died. And we'll get to it later, but in 1915, they'll have the sinking of the Lusitania incident that occurs. And that really helps spark the United States to back the Allied side in the war, and why the United States gets in the war later. But I'll talk later about the causes of why the United States gets in the war in another podcast. I usually mention about, this is probably not on the Canvas quiz, but I'll mention, the different nicknames. Like in World War I, there was a lot of nicknames for all the soldiers that fought in the war. The Germans had all kinds of nicknames that they were, of course, called. Because, going back in history, people talked about the invasion of the Huns and all that. And so a lot of the allies, like Britain, France, and the West, started calling the Germans the Huns, when they invaded into France, because they kind of, saw them as like baby killers and things like that. So they called them that, the Huns, the Hun, is coming to kill us, and all that. Of course, some people called the Germans the Fritz, because it seemed like every German was named Frederick, because Frederick, the nickname for Frederick is Fritz, like Frederick the Great, etc. Some people call him Kraut. Yeah, Kraut or Krauts, because, the Germans were known for eating sauerkraut with sausage and things like that. And so they got that name also. I think the French called him le Boche, which le Boche meant cabbage head, because they ate sauerkraut, which meant cabbage, The British, there's different nicknames they called them, but the British soldiers, they started calling him Tommy. Tommy soldier. And I say the reason for it is because like Tommy or Thomas. Tom was a common name. A lot of British, English people had. And I think they say there's a story where the first soldier that volunteered to fight in World War One was a guy named Tommy Atkins. So Tommy was one of the names they used as the nickname. French had a nickname. They were called the Poilus, P-O-I-L-U, Poilus, which meant hairy or hairy ones. A lot of the French soldiers wouldn't shave, and they had beards, and so they were given that nickname, the Poilus, the hairy or hairy ones. The Italians, believe it or not, I think they sometimes call the Italians macaroni, believe it or not. Yeah, macaroni, because Italians ate pasta, which I guess nobody ever heard of before. That's what they call them, the macaroni. Russians had different names. Like I know in post World War One or at the end of the war, you had different types of Russians. They had the communist Russians, of course, were called Reds, Red Russians. And then you had the so-called White Russian. White Russians were anti-communist, pro Romanov. They were called a White Russian or whites. So the Americans, when they came over, of course, were called all kinds of names. The British called the Yanks, Yankee, that kind of thing. And then, of course, there's another name that was very famous you may have heard of. They called the American soldiers that came over and fought in France, they were called Doughboys. Yeah, Doughboys. The reason why they're called Doughboys, there's two theories on it. One is that they ate bread or donuts or something, and so the term doughboy was kind of came about from that. And then I heard another theory was that it had to do with their uniforms. They have buttons on them that look like a donut with a hole in it. It's a doughboy. So I don't know. So anyway, those are the different nicknames. The Anzacs, we'll get to them later. They fight in the war too. The Anzacs were Australian and New Zealander corps that fought under the British in World War One. And of course, the Australians were called Aussies, and the New Zealanders that fought in the war were called Kiwis. You know about that. And World War One was their first war they ever fought in, Australia and New Zealand. So, all right, yeah. And of course, we'll kind of get into some of the campaigns in the war that were very famous. They had the Gallipoli Campaign, which was fought mostly in 1915. I think it goes up to like the beginning of 1916. The Gallipoli Campaign was a campaign that was part of that Middle Eastern front. And what happened was it was caused by the fact that the Ottoman Empire had entered World War I on the German side. It happened at the end of 1914. This kind of threw a monkey wrench into the war because look at this map here I've got of Europe at the time. You can see the Ottoman Empire, you see, which is around the Black Sea. With them coming in the war, that hurt the Russians. Basically, it blockaded them because now the Ottoman Empire was part of the Central Powers at that point. And so what that meant is that the British came up with this idea, which they believe it was actually Winston Churchill's idea. Churchill, at the time, was the First Lord of the Admiralty with the British Navy. It was like a government position. He wasn't Prime Minister until World War II later. And anyway, he had this idea where they could use the British Navy, their military forces, and other allies like the French and other allies to bring up forces through the Aegean Sea. And the idea was to attack this peninsula, which is kind of in the western part of the Ottoman Empire, which is called the Gallipoli Peninsula. It's kind of on the European side. And it's kind of around what they call the Dardanelles Strait, which runs up into the Black Sea. And the idea was to seize that peninsula, and then what they would do was that they would march up and then seize the capital of Turkey at the time, which was Constantinople, which the British still called it that. The Turks called it Istanbul. So they thought they could do that. They could knock the Turks out of the war. And then what they could do is that they could then, the Turks out the war, they could then reopen the Black Sea. And then they could, send supplies to Russia. So at this point, Russia, was blocked off in the east. And that's bad. It's going to later, end up causing a lot of problems with them. And I think it's actually one of the main reasons why the Russian Revolution broke out was because of that, not just because of them losing to the Germans in the, in the Eastern Front and all that later. So, so what happened was the British with the French brought up forces. Also, the British got Australian and New Zealander troops. They started volunteering for the war. Called the Anzacs, they were called. I told you about the Australian New Zealander Corps. They participated in the war. I think they had about 150,000 Australian and New Zealander troops were involved. It's one of their biggest campaigns of World War I, their first war they were ever in, I told you. And so they were involved in, I think they had other forces of the French, but most of the other forces were British that they fought. They tried to actually sail up the Dardanelles Strait with their navies, but what happened was the Turks, with help from the Germans, had mined the whole thing. And they also brought in artillery to fire at their ships. They sank some of their ships and they had to back out. And then what happened was, starting about April of 1915, the Allies then tried to land on the western peninsula, the Gallipoli Peninsula, like the western side of it, with their forces. They formed beachheads, but they couldn't break in to inland. They couldn't seize the peninsula, and so they ended up suffering a lot of casualties. I think combined, they would have 150,000 killed and wounded, the Allies, in trying to seize the peninsula. The Anzacs themselves lost about 35,000 men. Were actually killed and wounded, which is like 1/4 their force. About 25% of their force got killed or wounded. 11,000 actually got killed, the Anzacs. It's a pretty good amount for the small group that was involved. And one of the big, I don't know if you know about the war, but there was a big Turkish general that was a big hero of the whole Gallipoli Campaign. His name was Mustafa Kemal. You may have heard of him. He was actually the main general that fought the Allied side. He was backed up by the Germans, and he was a big hero after the war. In fact, they later called him a nickname, which was Ataturk. And later, if you know, Mustafa Kemal is the father of Turkey, because after the war, he would help found the Republic of Turkey, which I think was founded in 1923. He was later the first president of the Republic of Turkey. So yeah, I guess that war is important for the Turks later because they formed that state after the war. And the Battle of Anzac Bay, Battle of Gallipoli, which were battles associated with the Gallipoli Campaign, did not go well at all for the Allies. So that part of the war, the campaigns, I guess, in World War I were really a total fiasco for. So they wouldn't be able to defeat the Central Powers by going through that way. They had to find another way. All right, so they withdraw from there. Also, we'll talk about, I've got a few minutes, I'll go ahead and talk about also the 1916 battles. 1916, 1917 was the peak of the stalemate battles in World War I, especially on the Western Front. There were two real big bloody battles in 1916 that happened on the Western Front. They had the Battle of Verdun, which was fought in northern France, and they also had the Battle of the Somme. And the Battle of Verdun, first of all, was, of course, considered to be the most famous battle of World War I. It was fought between February to December February to December 1916. There's actual dates on it. And last time was 10, 11 months. It was one of the longest battles of the war. It's also the greatest battle of World War I and one of the bloodiest battles of all time. It's now the second bloodiest battle behind the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II. A lot of men were killed and wounded in the battle. I think it's like 2 million casualties was how many casualties was in the Battle of Verdun. It was that bloody. This is combined on both the French and the German side, mostly in the war. And the battle started in February 21st, 1916. And the Battle of Verdun was a German offensive battle that was planned by this German general named Erich von Falkenhayn. Falkenhayn believed that if they could concentrate their forces on one spot in the front and then break through, that would be the end of the war for the French. And so Falkenhayn picked the city of Verdun, which was kind of on the northeastern border between France and Belgium. That's where it was. It was located on a river called the Meuse River. And so the Germans decided to concentrate their forces there, right there. And Falkenhayn said a statement about what he was going to do to the French at Verdun. He said famously that he was going to bleed the French white at Verdun. And what he meant by that was he wanted to use a war of attrition, kill more French soldiers than German, and that would end the war, which is kind of a bloody way to do it, but that was what they thought the best way to do it was. And so the Germans would try to concentrate all their might on that one spot right there. The front lines itself were only about 6 miles. That's it. 6-mile front where they fought at Verdun. Pretty much the trenches between it were like no man's land, with nothing there pretty much. And a total of 6 million troops combined fought at Verdun. That's how many people were involved in fighting in that battle. The French side was led by different generals. The most famous was Marshal Pétain, also known as Henry Philippe Pétain. He was the main general on the French side. He had a nickname. He was called the Lion of Verdun. And so he was in command of the French forces, and Falkenhayn was with the German forces in the war. By the way, both sides, the German and the French, fought over forts that were around Verdun. There were 2 big forts that were very strategic. There was one called Fort Vaux, V-A-U-X, and Fort Douaumont, D-O-U-A-M-O-U-N-T, which were around the Meuse River area. They fought for control of them, and I think Douaumont itself changed hands 2 or 3 times, back and forth between the French and the Germans. And the battle was really a stalemate. Neither side could really break through. I think the French would push them back, a couple miles, and the Germans would push them back a couple miles. But neither side really could do much. And the French got so desperate at Verdun that they started trying to use a motto to boost the morale of the French forces. And Pétain had heard of this slogan that another general had been using at the time, which was "They shall not pass." And so that's what they start telling, all the French soldiers, don't let the Germans pass, break through. They start writing on the walls, "They shall not pass." And so that, in a sense, helped, boost the morale of the forces. And the Germans eventually never broke through. However, the British decided to counterattack the Germans with a battle like north of the Battle of Verdun, which was called the Battle of the Somme, which took place between July to about December 1916. It was a counterattack battle around the Somme River Valley, north of, like I said, the Meuse River. And that was one of the most famous British battles that they fought in. The British would suffer a lot of casualties in that battle. In fact, the first day of battle, which I think was July 1st, the British lost 60,000 men. That's how bloody these battles were. And part of why these battles were so bad was because the fact that both sides had machine guns. They just would mow you down. You try to, get out of your trench. There's an old saying which is over the top. They say over the top. That means they basically jump out of your trenches and try to take their trenches, and they just get mowed down. You just had no chance. On top of all the artillery they shot at you as well. So the British did actually push the Germans back with the Battle of the Somme, mostly because of the British in 1916 introduced a new kind of weapon, which was the tank. Something they came up with. And so the tank kind of plays kind of a somewhat of a minor role in the war. And so the tank was something that they first used about some. But both were examples of stalemate battles that happened in 1916 and 1917. And both the Verdun and the Somme were very bloody. Both combined, like I said, both of them combined 2 million casualties, killed and wounded, etc. Really awful. Now, I'm going to stop here for this podcast, but later I'm going to talk about the rest of the war from 1916 to 1918. We'll talk about the end of the war. We'll talk about the Russian Revolution that breaks out. We'll talk about the Treaty of Versailles and post-World War I Europe afterwards. That's coming up later. World War I Part 2 History Podcast.